Families don't just fall apart out of nowhere. Friendships don't just explode for no reason. Communities, movements, even whole societies, they don't collapse randomly. There's a pattern. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. Maybe it's someone online spreading rage like wildfire. Maybe it's a leader who turns followers into fanatics. Or maybe it's your dad, your friend, or your partner. But why do they do it? Why do they turn into these monsters? In this video, I will talk about these exact 5 kinds of people that don't just ruin relationships. They break reality. And most of the time, they don't even know they're doing it. So let's get into it. Our primitive tendency is to shut our eyes to evil and drive it over some frontier, like the Old Testament scapegoat, which was supposed to carry the evil into the wilderness. In the dark corridors of the human psyche, there is a place we often refuse to enter, a mansion of repressed emotions, denied impulses, and hidden shame. Jung called this the shadow, the unseen house of everything we cannot or will not admit about ourselves. And among us walks a particular kind of person, the shadow projector, who, instead of facing that house, casts its darkness onto others. This is the person who cannot tolerate fault in themselves. Their entire psychological survival depends on the illusion of purity, of moral cleanliness, of being on the right side. But this illusion requires a cost, the continual projection of everything ugly, wounded, or shameful within themselves onto someone else. As I read somewhere, we scapegoat when we project what is dark, shameful, and denied about ourselves onto others. The person who habitually scapegoats may believe they are defending truth or justice, but in reality, they are exiling pieces of their own psyche, flaws, fears, hatreds they dare not own, and hunting for someone else to carry them. Carl Jung warned us, when we do not recognize our projections, the projection-making factor then has a free hand to warp our perception of reality. In other words, the more we disown the shadow, the more it blinds us. What we refuse to integrate within becomes a distorted lens through which we view the world. And through that lens, everyone begins to look like a threat. Enemies multiply. Paranoia deepens. We don't see people as complex human beings. We see caricatures of the darkness we're fleeing within ourselves. This phenomenon is anything but rare. In fact, it's one of the oldest and most dangerous psychological patterns in human history. Entire regimes have been built on this kind of projection. Totalitarian movements from the 20th century scapegoated minorities, dissidents, and outsiders, painting them as the root of all evil, while the actual rot festered within the accusers. The Holocaust, Stalinist purges, McCarthyism, the Rwandan genocide, all were fueled by this toxic mechanism, the refusal to see the shadow within and the urge to destroy it out there. But this isn't just history, it's now. In our own era, the shadow projector lives on. It shows up in political discourse that paints opponents as pure evil, in social media mobs that hunt for scapegoats to tear apart, and in the algorithms that feed outrage to people who already believe they're surrounded by enemies. The dynamic is the same. I am righteous, you are corrupt. I am clean, you are dangerous. And because I cannot bear to see the flaws in myself, I will magnify them in you. This person often appears outwardly confident, aggressively sure of their positions, morally outraged, constantly pointing fingers. But beneath this surface lies deep fragility. They are easily threatened by those who mirror the very traits they suppress. A compassionate person might inspire jealousy, a free thinker might awaken envy, a vulnerable person might expose their own buried weakness, and so they must attack. Behaviorally, this manifests in blame shifting, scapegoating, and black and white thinking. The shadow projector doesn't see nuance. They see sides, right versus wrong, us versus them. And they always belong to the virtuous side. Their enemies, by contrast, are cartoonish villains, wholly evil, stupid, corrupt, or dangerous. The possibility that the enemy is simply human, just like them, is unthinkable. It would collapse the fragile boundary they've built between themselves and their repressed self. This archetype is especially dangerous in times of uncertainty. In eras of social instability, economic collapse, cultural upheaval, technological change, the need for psychological security intensifies. People cling to black and white narratives, to scapegoats, to enemies that make their internal chaos seem externally manageable. They project their fear and shame outward because it feels safer than turning inward. And with every new crisis, the shadow projector finds fresh targets. Immigrants, the other political party, elites, deplorables, or anyone who doesn't echo their version of reality. The shadow projector is not evil, or maybe they are, but they are dangerous, especially when their denial remains unconscious. Because the shadow does not vanish when ignored. It grows teeth. It becomes prejudice, paranoia, hate crimes, and ideological extremism. It fuels racism, xenophobia, witch hunts, cult behavior, anything that frames a group of people as less than human, worthy of blame, or responsible for all of society's ills. And yet all of it originates within the projector. Jung was blunt in his warning. Our world will never reach a state of order until everyone acknowledges their own shadow. The alternative is not just personal dysfunction, but collective chaos. If we refuse to own the darkness within us, we will continue to unleash it onto the world, and the world will burn for it. And some let that inner darkness grow so large, so inflated, that it swallows their identity whole, which is a whole other dangerous kind of group according to Carl Jung, which I will discuss now. What makes this state of possession so dangerous is that it prevents the ego and the conscious mind from achieving a genuine orientation to reality. There is a strange transformation that can happen to a human being, an inner takeover that strips away individuality and replaces it with myth. The person no longer speaks or acts as themselves. Instead, they become a mask, a symbol, a role in a collective fantasy. Jung called this archetypal possession, and he warned that when it occurs, a man becomes a flat collective figure, a mask behind which he can no longer develop as a human being. This person is not simply obsessed, they are inhabited. They are driven by a singular psychic force, an archetype that overwhelms the ego and floods their life with grand meaning. That archetype might be the hero, the messiah, the savior, the martyr, the prophet, the trickster, the tyrant, or even the demon. But the result is always the same. The person loses their autonomy. They become inflated, over-identified with something beyond the human, something mythic. And once this inflation takes hold, it no longer matters who they used to be. They have become an image. Jung was deeply concerned by this phenomenon, not just for the individual, but for society. When someone is gripped by an archetype, they are no longer fully present. They act out ancient patterns with modern consequences. He wrote, "This process leads to a complete loss of the ego, so that the person becomes a mere automaton." This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a psychological reality. The archetype possesses them like a spirit. Their thoughts and actions are compulsive, charged with an unnatural intensity. They cannot stop because, in their mind, they are no longer just a person. They are a mission. In modern terms, this archetype-possessed individual can be seen in a wide range of extreme figures. The cult leader who believes he's been chosen to usher in a new world. The political ideologue who sees himself as a lone truth-teller destined to save the nation. The radical revolutionary who burns everything down in the name of cleansing corruption. The tech visionary who believes he's transcending human limits, even as he disconnects from actual humanity. These individuals aren't merely ambitious. They are under the spell of a grand narrative that defines their identity and justifies any action, no matter how destructive. They see themselves not just as someone with a mission, but as the mission itself. They act as if propelled by divine purpose or inner destiny. Their worldview is rigid and all-encompassing. They do not tolerate ambiguity. They reject complexity. Everything must fit their myth. You are either with them or against them. Their behavior is marked by fanaticism. They obsess over their cause or identity, publicly performing it through speeches, social media posts, or aggressive actions. They often frame their journey as part of a larger struggle against corruption, evil, lies, or apocalypse. They may speak in sweeping moral terms, yet display a terrifying indifference to real human suffering. Because they believe they are guided by something greater, they lose the ability to reflect on their own fallibility. As Jung put it, inflation reaches beyond the confines of humanity, causing a loss of free will, delusion, and enthusiasm in good and evil alike. The psychodynamics of this are profound. The ego, your center of conscious awareness, gets pulled down into the archetype, swallowed by it. What replaces it is a mythic script. The person acts it out without knowing they are acting. Jung described this process as a psychic eclipse, in which the whole ego consciousness is dissolved. They no longer evolve as a person. They repeat a pattern, compulsively. They have forfeited their humanity. This is not just dangerous on a personal level. Archetype possession is contagious. Jung called such individuals dangerous as sources of infection. Their certainty, intensity, and mythic clarity attract others, especially those who are lost or vulnerable. And history confirms the danger. From apocalyptic cult leaders like Jim Jones and Heaven's Gate, to genocidal dictators like Hitler or Pol Pot, to messianic revolutionaries and ideologues, these individuals leave ruin in their wake. They override ordinary moral boundaries because they believe they operate on a higher plane. Today, this pattern is not limited to fringe groups or the past. Influencers build empires around savior or warrior identities. Political movements increasingly treat leaders as godlike or demonic figures. Tech billionaires talk like prophets or architects of human destiny, and in each case we see the same symptoms: grandiosity, rigidity, a single vision imposed on reality, and a dangerous loss of self-awareness. The archetype-possessed individual may inspire crowds, but they are no longer free. They are not choosing. They are acting out something older than themselves, something collective, impersonal, and dangerously powerful. And as Jung warned, the price of this possession is high. He can no longer develop as a human being, but not all possessions look grand or messianic. Some take a softer shape, disguised as love, longing, or wounded ideals. One another kind, which I will discuss in the next chapter. And this is a very important one too. Only the animal man can be possessed. The man who is possessed by the anima and the woman who is possessed by the animus are just beasts. In every person lives a contrasexual archetype, what Jung called the anima in men and the animus in women. These inner figures serve as psychic bridges between the conscious ego and the unconscious depths. But when these figures are not integrated, when they are not met with awareness and balance, they can take over. Jung warned that a state of anima possession must be prevented, because when it isn't, the individual becomes governed not by reason or grounded emotion, but by projection, fantasy, and irrational intensity. The anima or animus possessed person is driven by unconscious ideals of the opposite sex. A man may become enthralled by an illusory muse, a romanticized feminine figure that he projects onto a real woman, falling into immediate obsessive love only to find that the woman can never live up to the fantasy. He might become moody, irrationally emotional, or feel controlled by inner feminine moods. A woman, dominated by her animus, may identify with an invisible inner critic or father figure, often becoming overly argumentative, rigid, or obsessed with asserting authority. In both cases, the psyche is overtaken by an inner voice that doesn't truly belong to them. The person becomes dreamy, irrational, or even fanatically emotional, They lose touch with boundaries, whether by falling too fast, clinging too tightly, or reacting with disproportionate rage when things fall apart. Their relationships are no longer about real connection, but about fulfilling an unconscious script. The behavior is marked by chaos, intense infatuation, irrational jealousy, emotional dependency, or explosive arguments. These patterns are not just relational issues, they are signs that something deeper is driving the ship. Jung noted that the anima and animus, when not integrated, are autonomous. That means they don't respond to logic or even self-awareness. Their influence is stubborn. They hijack judgment and distort perception, often making the individual mistake fantasy for reality. Psychodynamically, this is a partial possession. The ego hasn't fully dissolved, but it's no longer in control. The individual cannot easily distinguish between their own thoughts and the archetypal voices speaking through them. And because the anima animus also serves as a mediator between ego and unconscious, when that connection is disrupted, the whole inner structure begins to wobble. The danger of this dynamic lies in poor decision-making, toxic relationships, and emotional damage, both to oneself and others. When a man chases an idealized muse, he can become blind to red flags, overly attached, or deeply wounded when the fantasy crumbles. When a woman obeys her inner animus, she may alienate others with combative rigidity or self-sabotage through hypercritical thinking. And in a collective sense, this energy can even infect crowds, especially in romantic or patriarchal cults, where the group acts as if possessed by a fantasy of ideal love or authority. Here, irrational rage or idealism becomes contagious. And for this, Jung's solution was not repression, but integration. The anima and animus are not enemies. They are bridges to deeper wholeness. But if left unconscious, they distort the psyche, leading to obsessive fantasies and emotional chaos. And as history and literature have shown, from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet to the lives shattered by infatuated revenge, neglecting this balance can turn passion into tragedy. When the psyche is not balanced, it doesn't just spiral into emotional turmoil, it can also inflate into something even more dangerous, an ego that is untouchable, self-obsessed, and incapable of seeing anyone beyond itself. Another kind of dangerous ones, which I am sure everyone has encountered in their lives. And a little bit of it is healthy, but people usually don't have just a little bit of it. Only the danger is that people become identical with their personas. The professor with his textbook, the tenor with his voice. Then the damage is done. Henceforth, he lives exclusively against the background of his own biography. The persona is the mask we wear, the socially adapted self we present to the world. Ideally, it's flexible, a tool to navigate society without losing the core of who we are. But when the ego fuses with this mask, when a person begins to believe they are the mask, the result is narcissistic inflation. Jung warned that an overgrown ego, detached from the self, becomes blind, brittle, and destructive. This is the pathology of the inflated persona. This type lives entirely in performance. Their ego has latched onto a grand image, hero, genius, leader, visionary, and refuses to let go. Everything about them revolves around being admired, appearing special, and maintaining control. Jungian analyst Sarah Graham put it bluntly. Narcissists refuse to look at the negative aspects of their shadow selves. They idealize themselves and devalue others. In short, they preserve their heroic self-image at all costs and project anything unpleasant onto the people around them. On the surface, they may seem confident, even magnetic, but underneath lies a fragile ego constantly seeking validation. Criticism is treated as betrayal. They may lash out, manipulate, or demean others to preserve the illusion of perfection. Relationships become arenas for admiration, not mutual connection. Their behavior reflects the rigidity of someone who cannot tolerate vulnerability. They demand praise, dominate conversations, and spin narratives that place themselves at the center. If challenged, they may gaslight, deflect blame, or attack. Their entire identity is built on being seen as exceptional, and any crack in that illusion is felt as a threat to their survival. Psychodynamically, this is an over-identification with an ego ideal. The person has fused with a collective archetype, ruler, savior, mastermind, without integrating its opposite. They refuse to acknowledge weakness, doubt, or moral failure. Jung warned that this kind of imbalance leads to psychological one-sidedness. The inflated ego puffs itself up beyond humanity, leaving no room for shadow, humility, or growth. The consequences can be devastating. In relationships, this person may initially enchant others, only to later control, belittle, or emotionally exploit them. In society, they may become authoritarian leaders, bullying bosses, or ruthless entrepreneurs who place personal success above ethics. Their inability to integrate the shadow means they see critics not as guides, but as enemies. And when inflated egos clash, conflict becomes inevitable. The inflated persona offers power, but at the cost of authenticity. And in the long run, the price is steep: isolation, emptiness, and the collapse of the very image they fought to protect. And one kind of them might be seen in the following kind of archetypes as well. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Self-Reliance. There is a kind of person who is utterly certain of their own goodness. They believe they are on the right side of history, the voice of truth, the guardian of virtue. But behind this moral confidence often hides a dangerous blindness, a refusal to see their own shadow. Jung warned that without confronting the shadow, the repressed or unacknowledged parts of ourselves, our morality becomes rigid, hostile, and deeply incomplete. The righteous purist is a person who sees the world in absolutes. Good and evil are clearly divided. There is no gray, no ambiguity, no complexity. They are the crusader, the prophet, the enforcer of truth. And anyone who disagrees is not simply mistaken. They are corrupt, dangerous, or evil. Jung insisted that until people learn to live beyond binary black and white thinking, society remains split and unstable. The righteous purist embodies that instability. These individuals see themselves as pure and therefore refuse to recognize their own flaws or contradictions. They preach, condemn, and rally others behind them, often with fiery rhetoric that inflames division. Their behavior is marked by judgment and punitive fervor. They call out sinners, demand ideological purity, and often lead cancel campaigns or ideological purges. They disown their own capacity for wrongdoing and instead project it outward. The world becomes filled with enemies who reflect what they cannot accept in themselves. Psychodynamically, this is classic shadow projection. The individual represses any traits they deem bad or weak, and then sees those traits everywhere else. Jung observed that small groups filled with crazy ideas, resentments, and irrationalities can infect the collective. The purist may start as a lone voice, but they often gather followers by offering a simplistic narrative. We are good, they are evil, purge the evil. The danger of this mindset is not only moral arrogance, but the potential for violence. History is filled with moral crusaders who justified horrific acts in the name of purity, whether religious inquisitions, ideological purges, or radical revolutions. Once convinced that their cause is righteous and their enemies are subhuman, any means becomes justified. And for this, Jung's antidote is shadow integration, the honest, often painful work of seeing your own darkness. Without that, righteousness becomes a mask for repression, and repression always seeks an outlet. As he said, your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes.